In the last couple of years, Republican fascists have launched a nationwide assault on the right of students to learn the true history of this country. They aim to force teachers to teach a false version of American history, where the foundational role of slavery and genocide is erased or whitewashed, and the big lie of American greatness is shoved down everyone's throats. The state of Florida and the fascist governor there, Ron DeSantis, have been on the front lines of this, most recently announcing a ban on advanced placement African American studies classes in high school. Just yesterday, the College Board, which is preparing the classes, announced a revised curriculum, which purges the name of a number of Black writers and scholars and downgrades topics like affirmative action and Black Lives Matter. Our correspondent Rafael Caderas has been covering this on the RNL show. He begins this week by exposing just some of the bloody history of the state of Florida, history that fascists like Ron DeSantis are trying to suppress.
Did you know that before Florida became a state, it was a refuge for escaped slaves? Although the Spanish who colonized Florida brutally conquered the native peoples through war and disease, they did abolish slavery there in 1693. So as cotton plantations and the slave system expanded in the U.S., Florida actually became a safe haven for runaways who crossed the border and lived among the Seminole Indians. Hundreds of escaped slaves and Seminoles even occupied an abandoned fort, armed themselves, and provided protection for a whole community of free people. Many more fugitives from around the U.S. came to settle there. To the slave masters and white supremacists ruling the U.S., even the mere existence of what they called the Negro Fort was intolerable. In 1816, the genocidal slave owner, Andrew Jackson, who was already known for killing and removing Indians and would later be responsible for the deadly Trail of Tears, led a military assault on the fort, completely destroying it and massacring 270 men, women, and children. Fast forward to 1923, 100 years ago, a mob of 1,500 white people in Florida spent 7 days killing, raping, and burning the entire African-American town of Rosewood to the ground.
In 1923, the black town of Rosewood was a land of opportunity.
You've been drifting along, Mr. Man.
Seemed like forever.
Colored folks own all the land around here, all the businesses too. Man can make a new start around here, make something of himself.
Until the day, one woman's false accusation
Tell me the truth. Was it truly our color done this to you?
unleashed a fury against their town.
If you find him, well, you know what to do.
There be some trouble around here, sir. To show use your help.
There ain't no way in the world one man got enough bullets for all them crackers.
And a search for the guilty became a hunt for the innocent.
These are real folks dying. Women and children ain't done nothing wrong to no soul.
Now, colored folk just can't be running all the time. There comes a time when you got to stand up and defend your rights.
Minnie Lee Langley was only a child when she became a refugee. Now, she's a great-grandmother. At her home in Jacksonville, Florida, we talked to her about the place where she was born, Rosewood, Florida, the place that haunts her memory.
I know they killed my aunt, and they killed my granddaddy. Made my granddaddy dug his hole. He didn't have but one arm, but they made him dug his own grave. And he prayed, and they shot him backwards in the grave.
At Rosewood.
At Rosewood.
In his new article on Revcom.us, America, truly a model of depraved racist genocide, how can any decent person deny that we need a revolution to overthrow this system? Bob Avakian makes this profound point. Think about what this means. For nearly 100 years, not only were thousands of black people lynched, but at many of these lynchings, there were mass gatherings of white people in a picnic and celebratory atmosphere. And then when the bodies were hung and often burned, many of these white people would go and cut off body parts of the person who'd been lynched as souvenirs in a carnival atmosphere. He then goes on to write, and that's not all. Photographs were taken and postcards were made and sold all over the country. Postcards of the lynchings. Think about what this says. In terms of depravity, you can't find anything Hitler and the Nazis did that was worse than this. You had the Nazi Dr. Mengele, who went to the concentration camps and performed grotesque experiments on the bodies of Jews who were imprisoned there. And that's horrible. That's part of one of the worst atrocities in the history of humanity. The whole Holocaust, the systematic slaughter of millions of Jews by the Nazis. But again, in terms of depravity, even after slavery, what was going on for nearly 100 years in this country is no less horrific. It belongs in the same category with the Nazi atrocities. While all the time we're being told this is the greatest country in the world. This is the leader of the free world. This is an inspiration to people all over the world. This is the history and reality of this country. And no, it's not ancient and irrelevant history either. It's the history they are still trying to whitewash and rewrite in order to perpetuate white supremacy and carry out more crimes against Black people and other people of color. Just look at the modern day Nazis in the Republican Party and their efforts to ban so-called critical race theory, and really any education which teaches people about the real history and reality of racial oppression, and to replace it with patriotic education about the special greatness of America. In other words, lies. We've been covering this on the RNL show.
In recent months, fascist media and politicians and a growing movement of fascist parents and others have been waging an escalating assault on what gets taught in the schools. They say they're going after critical race theory, an academic theory that originated in law schools to look at the relationship between race and the law. But really, they're using critical race theory as a catch-all buzzword to attack and shut down any honest discussion of the real history of this country and systemic racism.
School curricula have changed completely and become explicitly political and openly racist. And their curriculum that teaches their kids to hate their country.
Critical race theory is racism, pure and simple. And it should be rejected by every American of every race.
And let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
You know, there's already 20 states that drafted legislation to dictate, what can and can't be taught in schools, and specifically to dictate that teachers teach lies to the students. 6 states have already passed these laws, and these laws have language in them that say things like, you can't teach about the history of slavery in any way other than to say that it was a deviation from America's foundational principles. And we just have to say this completely flies in the face of the actual reality of this country. The first quote that Bob Avakian says in his book Basics is, "There would be no United States as we now know it today without slavery. That is a simple and basic truth." And this is exactly the simple and basic truth that these fascists want to outlaw. Since that segment aired over a year ago, the fascist assault on truth and education has escalated. At least 500 measures to ban the teaching of critical race theory have been proposed, passed, or adopted in 49 states. Ron DeSantis and the state of Florida have been leading the charge.
Critics call it the Don't Say Gay bill. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has signed it into law. The new law states that classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through 3rd grade.
Tonight, some Tampa Bay teachers say they are being forced to remove all books from their classrooms to comply with a controversial new state law.
And that they're having to pack up their books, some teachers, like this one, even covering them up, saying they fear being prosecuted. Having unvetted books or books that aren't allowed could result in a felony charge.
You can't teach that the foundations of our country were somehow evil.
And we're not going to tell other kids that they're oppressed based on their race.
We want education, not indoctrination. If you fall on the side of indoctrination, we're going to decline. If it's education, then we will do.
Listen to what Bob Avakian says in his recent interviews about this fascist moron.
Now you see some of these fascists openly saying, well, slavery wasn't really that bad. It did, some of the conditions of the slave improved from how they were living in Africa. I mean, just horrific stuff like this. And I see Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, made a statement where he said,
it was the American Revolution that caused people to question slavery. No one had questioned it before we decided as Americans that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights and that we are all created equal.
Well, this is just absolute bullshit, including, as I pointed out before, I think some of the slaves at least were questioning slavery before the Declaration of Independence was written, including in the uprisings of slaves, even during the colonial days before the country was founded.
Most recently, Ron DeSantis in the state of Florida banned an advanced placement course in African American studies.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is defending his administration's decision to block a course on African American studies from the state's public schools.
Now keep in mind, this AP class was prepared by the College Board, which is not a radical institution, and is already being taught in schools around the country. The College Board describes it as a multidisciplinary study of the African American diaspora that includes literature, the arts, science, politics, and geography. And yet DeSantis' Department of Education banned the course on the grounds that it violates Florida law and lacks educational value. Comedian D.L. Hughley was one of many people to call this shit out. He tweeted, "Ron DeSantis has banned African American history, saying it lacks educational value. Let me get this straight. It was illegal for slaves to learn, and now it's illegal to learn about slaves." Think about the insult on top of injury for this country to kidnap, enslave, rape, and torture black people for hundreds of years, and then to say that their history and culture has no educational value. All this as part of imposing a white supremacist brainwash and training a whole generation to be foot soldiers for a white Christian fascist America. Students and teachers have been speaking out against this.
What's your reaction to this AP African American Studies ban?
It's keeping African Americans silenced.
In my opinion, that it was targeted and I couldn't learn about my own history.
I think it just symbolizes blatant racism.
Marvin Dunn, a professor emeritus at Florida University, is defying the ban on AP African American Studies by leading high school students on Teach the Truth tours, stopping at sites of the worst white supremacist violence in the history of Florida, including Rosewood. Much more of this is needed in the face of this fascist assault on education. As we said last year on the RNL show, this is something that needs to be boomeranged back on these fascists. People need to go and seek out even more truth about the nature of this country in the face of this. Everyone, parents, students, people in society need to come to the defense of these teachers who are under attack. There needs to be massive defiance of these laws. It doesn't have to go down that this creates just a chill in society, right? This is something that can be, turned into massive resistance, and it needs to urgently. At the same time, people urgently need to pursue the truth that they are learning about this country. That this is a country founded on slavery and genocide, but take it further to what is the actual system, the capitalist system that has been at the foundation and that has been driving this racial oppression all the way up to the present. And they need to learn about the radical alternative to this. Baba Vakian has drafted a whole different constitution, with a radically different socialist economic system, a whole different political system, legal system, and yes, an educational system that actually tells people the truth and teaches, young people to be critical thinkers, right? So we're going to be out fighting for this revolution, bringing this understanding to people, and we need to unite with as many people to defeat these fascists as part of doing that.
In light of the responses to laws being passed across the country over whether or not the teaching of the actual history of this country, in particular the history of racist oppression, will be allowed to be taught to a generation of youth, we have produced a short video of Baba Vakian's recent article called Racism: Why Kids Need to Learn About It.
Racism. White kids need to learn about it.
Allow teachers to teach the truth.
A dozen Republican-led states seeking to ban or limit how the role of slavery and the pervasive effects of racism can be taught.
We're teaching people
that our country is a horrible place. It's a racist place.
We have reached the book burning stage.
We are eradicating this bad stuff. Burn them.
Today, fascist politicians, parent groups, and other fascist lunatics are waging a vicious campaign to ban books and in other ways keep kids and people generally from learning even some of the basic truth about this country, its actual history, and its present reality. One of the main lines of attack of these fascists is the claim that learning about white supremacy and racism will make children, that is, white children, feel bad.
We can and should teach this history without labeling a young child as an oppressor or requiring he or she feel guilt or shame.
Well, as a white youth growing up in the 1950s and early 1960s, when I learned about white supremacy and racism, it did make me feel bad. And that was a very good thing. It made me feel outraged. And yes, it made me feel ashamed. And that made me want to do something, to be part of fighting against this white supremacy and racism. And I was not alone in this. This was the experience of huge numbers, millions of white youth who came of age in that period, who were inspired by the civil rights movement and then by the more militant Black liberation movement, and became part of the revolutionary upsurge of the 1960s. These fascists are determined not to let something like that happen again in these highly charged times.
Poisoning the minds of our youth at school, turning some of them into revolutionaries in the streets.
And instead, they are setting out to mold a bunch of mindless white youth into rabid racists, similar to the Hitler Youth in Germany during the rise of the Nazi fascists there in the 1930s. Shutting down these fascists in their attempts to suppress the truth about this country is a crucial part of defeating this fascism overall. And this, in turn, can be and must be part of getting rid of this whole system of capitalism imperialism, which has bred this fascism, which has white supremacy built into its foundation and its ongoing functioning, which is the source of horrific oppression of literally billions of people here and throughout the world, and is a threat to the very existence of humanity through its escalating destruction of the environment and the continual danger of war between nuclear-armed capitalist imperialist powers, including the US, Russia, and China.